One interesting comment you made in your talk, which is something that some of us have written about, is that one of the failures of the 1991 and post reforms was the failure to really make to make the case to the electorate of why we're doing it, what does this serve. It was done in an ambiente of crisis, in a mode of stealth, as you also pointed out, and that seems to be sort of an original sin. I've written about it in a few places. That's now coming back to haunt the second generation reform process.
No, you're very right, Vivek, and it's an insight that we all wish we didn't have, simply because the ground reality, if were it to be different, but because reforms took place after such a long gap, that 1991 reforms really came on a mental mindset that really was derived 50s, 60s, Mrs. Gandhi's, the whole notion of the control of the financial sector and other sorts of reforms that or actions that she pursued, the nationalization of the banks, etc. So it took a long time to bear fruit. Also, because it was such a break from the past, was so hitting so hard at the kind of foundational philosophy of the early policymakers in India, that a lot of it happened by stealth. A lot of it happened by stroke of the pen, reforms that gradually played themselves out, whether it was in trade policy, whether it was in liberalization of industry, whether it was in liberalization of location of industry. All of these things happened slowly, gradually, and by stealth. That automatically, or by definition, prevented politicians projecting the fruits of liberalization, creating a constituency for reform. And to me, that's one of the biggest casualties of the long process that, or the long time it took for reforms to bear fruit. Today, if an average Indian holds a cell phone that is one of the cheapest in the world, that has one of the cheapest service plans in the world, he or she typically doesn't associate that with competition, with free entry, with the kind of amazing transformation of the telecom sector that took place in the mid-2000s and early 2000s in India. That absence of a link is what prevents politicians today from moving ahead with the second generation of reforms. But I think there's room. I mean, why do we have to talk about power sector reform? Why can't we project it as assured power supply at reasonable rates? So, you know, there is a change in the way in which reforms need to be projected. And again, that's something that's sort of getting lost in the hurly-burly of the day-to-day politics that seems to be ruling today.
So a different sort of narrative has to be cast in a certain sense.
Absolutely.
And the average cell phone user convinced that it was liberalization that's given him or her these very cheap, the cheapest in the world. In fact, I think it's cheaper to roam in Canada on an Indian cell phone plan than have a local one. And interestingly enough, there again is a sector that's been tarnished through a corruption scandal. So people, when they think about cell phone liberalization, might think of the 2G spectrum scam, and not of the earlier phase of reform that opened up this whole sector.
And again, this goes back to the absence of the second generation of reforms. Typically, the second generation of reforms, almost every country, tend to address these very issues of rent-seeking, patronage, crony capitalism, which, unless they are decidedly moved out of country's economic policy framework, tend to corrode the the benefits and the fruits of the first generation of reforms. And because these haven't happened, so we see these scams, particularly in the allocation of natural resources like frequency spectrum, like mining rights, like land. So these are all manifestations of that absence. And it's a huge opportunity, and it's not too late, by any means not too late, to get back on track and to address these issues in a reasonably sensible, rational way, not let the best become the enemy of the good. I think just the dividends from following through with the reform process that Dr. Manmohan Singh started back in the early 90s would be just tremendous.